The contemporary critical article by Dickson Bruce suggests two routes for the concept of double consciousness that Du Bois wields in this chapter and throughout the Souls of Black Folk. And he argues that romantic literature and psychological literature are these two roots of this concept, and they through his discussion they form an interesting kind of tension within the concept. The first romantic literature source goes back to Goethe and Emerson and the transcendental philosophy of those authors and similar authors at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And in this sort of literature, there's a transcendental spirit that yearns for its higher nature and of nature in general, that there is that nature is valuable, and the spirit is part of that and yearns towards its true sublime nature. And in contrast to that, kind of the earthly grubbing for survival is what people tend to get bogged down in, and that weighs on this transcendental spirit. So within romantic literature, you have a kind of doubling of the higher, the spirit versus flesh, of the higher nature versus the kind of lower bodily requirements of living. And in relation to that, you can think about the contrasts that Du Bois draws regularly throughout the text between the Negro spiritual contribution and the American material world in which he finds himself. That that his spirit, his height, his blue sky is hidden behind a veil, and that veil then is the the American world that he finds himself in, and so that's a kind of a contrast that is part of the double consciousness that you see running throughout this concept in the text, that sort of suggestion gives the sense that Du Bois thinks that Black people are superior to white people. But that runs in contrast to what he often says in terms of racial relations, that there's a contribution that each race has to make to the other race. So it's useful to try to interpret what he's saying here in terms of transcendental spirit in relation to that other tension, and also in relation to the tension that comes from the second concept, which is the concept through psychological literature from people like William James and the other research at this time on split personality, which in again late 19th century, early 20th century, split and multiple personalities was a kind of fad at this time. There was a French researcher who had discovered multiple personality of 4 or 5 different personalities throughout the course of his therapy of this woman. James also was investigating multiple personalities and split personalities. So this concept also arguably, or at least Bruce argues that that this concept also is playing a role or influencing this idea of double consciousness. And and there we have a kind of psychosis, suggestion that double consciousness is a kind of psychosis, which is a negative thing, but Bruce argues that it also functions as a way to articulate difference that's not a kind of biological determinism. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there was still a legacy, or not still, but a deep legacy from the 18th and 19th century of scientific racism, where it was argued that biology determined different character traits and intellectual abilities, and so that was still a very influential idea. And so if Du Bois is going to try to articulate the value of the Negro race in relation to the white race, and say that there is a valuable contribution that his people can make to the world, then he needs to articulate that in some sort of way that doesn't play into the biological determinism of the contemporary period. And so to articulate it as double consciousness, as a way of thinking and a way of being, is one way to articulate difference without that determination. And also there is, and this is one of the ways in which I think the concept continues to resonate in contemporary literature and contemporary critical race theory, is the way of reconciling identities, that people who live in different worlds, the world of color, of your ethnic identity, and the world of the dominant identity, the white world. You have to negotiate in both of these different worlds, and how do you do that? There's a concept called code switching, which is where you articulate the rules and the language and the style of the white world when you're in that world, and then when you're in your home world, then you can articulate and use the language and style and ideas of your your own people. And so double consciousness articulates that that double identity, the sense in which you're the same person when you're in these different contexts, but there is a fundamentally different way in which you are yourself in these different kinds of contexts, and that gives you a sense of, gives you this double consciousness. And you might ask yourself, what has your world been like? Has your world been a single sort of world, or has your world been a double or a triple world? There's a contemporary concept called intersectionality, and that concept is designed to recognize the doubleness or the multipleness of people's identity, the way in which being African and American is a kind of intersection. To be African American male, or Latina or Latinx, to be binary, to be non-binary, to be cisgender, or to be poor or wealthy. These are all different sorts of identities that come with particular sorts of rules of social life, and they can be in tension with one another. You can be at home in one world and be alienated in another world. And so negotiating those different identities and envisioning what would be justice and what would be peace in relation to those multiple competing identities and competing values is a very, very complicated sort of process. And the literature on intersectionality and race and gender and sexuality is a very rich literature that is worth considering in relation to one of the earliest forays into thinking and articulating this concept of identity.